Hello, this is Missy Roddenberry. I am the FTE coordinator for Effingham County Schools. This presentation is designed specifically for special education teachers to provide some instruction on how to code special education students for FTE funding. There are 2 FTE counts each year. They occur in the fall on the first Tuesday of October and in the spring on the first Thursday of March. This year the 2 count dates are October 1st and March 5th. The difference in the 2 counts is primarily related to the students who are reported. All students who were reported in the previous year's student record are reported in the first cycle. Only active students are reported in the second cycle. The first thing I want to talk about is some tips for how to schedule your students to maximize FTE funding. I do want to give a little disclaimer before we get started. Services that are delivered to students should always be those that are required by the student's individual needs. I am not suggesting here that we do anything that is not in the best interest of the students. Also, sometimes schedules are complicated based on the other things that are going on in the school's master schedule. So these suggestions are just ways that you can maximize funding to the extent that these things are practical and in the best interest of the students. First, for non-daily services, pull the students from the least funded categories at the school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. This has to do with the amount of funds that are given up from the regular ed program in order to earn funds with the special education program. For example, a kindergarten EIP student earns a lot more money than a 4th or 5th grade non-EIP student does. If a speech teacher pulls either one of these students, they are earning the same thing for the speech program. But if they pull a 4th or 5th grade non-EIP student, the amount of money given up from the general ed program is less than the amount of money that would be given up from a student that was in a kindergarten EIP class and pulled for speech services on FTE count day. So to the extent that you can, pull your least funded students on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays would be a good time to pull your lower level EIP students, your gifted students, and any students that may be already served in an area of special ed, your self-contained special education students. If you are serving a combination of pre-K and kindergarten to 12th grade students, try to serve the pre-K students on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Preschool students receive no funding through FTE. They are funded through a federal grant. Therefore, we are better off serving those students on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and try to maximize the number of kindergarten through 12th grade students we are able to serve on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Consultative students only receive funding if they receive direct services on the count days. The State Department does say that we can make changes to our schedule at logical breaks in the school year. We cannot adjust the schedule just to earn funds on a single count day. So I suggest serving these students on the first Tuesday of each month in the fall and on the first Thursday of each month in the spring. Students who are permanently IEP'd home, for these students, they only receive funding if they are actually served on count day. However, for students that are on hospital homebound and it is not a permanent placement in the IEP, for example, a student that has surgery, it is not required to serve those students on count day. As long as they are being seen for the required number of hours each week, they can be captured for their full funding as if they were in school on count day. A few other ways to maximize funding. Just remember that FTE reporting is based on normally scheduled services. So if you don't see a child that you would normally see on that first Tuesday in October because a student is absent, maybe the teacher is absent, it's picture day, a field trip, or any other reason, you will still code the student for the services they normally would have received on count day. And please always provide the data clerk with the data clerk change form after any meeting or change in services. This will ensure that everything is coded accurately as it occurs during the school year and will reduce the chance for error when you are verifying everything before the FTE count. Be aware of any pending placements as you approach the FTE count date. If you have a student that you can go ahead and get placed who you know is going to be placed, try to get them in services in place before that first Tuesday in October. As you are working with your data clerk to schedule students, please make sure that the only students that are placed into .9 sections are those that are IEP'd to actually receive that co-teaching or collaboration support. All services that are claimed for FTE funding must be IEP driven. For example, just because you have a speech student who ends up in a co-taught classroom does not mean that you should place that student on the .9 roster or claim that inclusion funding whenever the student does not have the documentation in his or her IEP for that service. However, if you do find that there are students who are in the .9 classes who would benefit educationally from the services provided by that additional staff member in the room, then you may consider amending the IEPs if it's appropriate to do so. You should also be aware that the Governor's Office of Student Achievement began doing academic data audits in 2015. Schools can be audited at any time, but often the reason is one of the following. Student performance levels are significantly higher or lower than expected, assessment data indicates irregularity, or there are errors in enrollment data reported to the Georgia DOE through FTE or student record. What I'd like to do now is go over several FTE reports that you are going to be asked to look at and help the data clerks verify in preparation for the FTE count this year. First, we have the Special Education Coding Errors Report. There are 3 different errors you may see on here. The first one, special ed status equals N, and a primary area of exceptionality is listed, but there isn't a special ed exit date within the current school year. If student exited special education in a previous year, remove the primary area. Otherwise, enter the special ed exit date and reason. Students retain their primary area of exceptionality information in Infinite Campus on their line of enrollment for the entire school year in which they are exited from special ed. The reason for this is because those students are still part of a Students with Disabilities subgroup for reporting in the current year for accountability purposes. Once the student is exited, however, the special ed status is changed to no and an exit date and exit reason must be entered. Make sure to give this information to the data clerk if they don't already have that information. The second error is area of exceptionality is autism, TBI, or SDD, and there is no area served indicated on the line of enrollment. For these 3 areas, they are valid primary areas of exceptionality, but they are not valid funding categories for FTE funding in Georgia. The direction from the State Department is that you must choose what the student is most like in determining which funding level they qualify for. For some students, this may not be clear and a student may fall into 2 different categories. For example, you may have a student that is a lot like an EBD student, maybe even served in an EBD classroom, but they may also have the medical documentation that would qualify them for OHI. Anytime you have a situation like that, look at the funding chart and make sure that you are choosing the area most like that generates the highest funding. Now, if it is clear that a student is definitely most like an LD student, then you need to report that. But if it can really be 2 different categories, make sure you look at the funding chart and make the best decision. The third error is student is active special education student but receives all IEP field in special education is in. This will result in funding loss. In the special education area of Infinite Campus, there is a place where the data clerk can key that information in. It could be that it was miskeyed by the data clerk, or maybe they received some information from the teacher at some point that said this should be no. Students should be receiving all services indicated in their IEP, and if they're not, then that is a problem. So if you feel that there is a student who is not receiving all of their services required by their IEP, make sure you report that to the appropriate special education administrator. The next report I want to look at is the Special Education Environment and Primary Area Errors report. There are a few different categories of error here. The first section, you see the primary area in enrollment does not match primary area in IEP. We actually pull the primary area for state reporting from what is in the line of enrollment, but we give this error so that if there is a correction that needs to be made to the IEP, you can make it there, or it just points out that the IEP is saying one thing but the line of enrollment says something different. That needs to be resolved. So if there's anything showing up in this area, you need to take a look at it. In this example, you can see that one area shows speech language impairment and the other shows visual impairment.
Visual impairment earns at a higher funding level than speech, so if it is correct that the IEP was modified and the primary area was changed to visual impairment, then the data clerk needs to be notified to update the line of enrollment. If, however, the IEP is incorrect, then there needs to be a request to unlock the IEP so that this change can be made. The second section, student does not have a special education setting indicated on line of enrollment. We do need that special education environment for every special education student, so just make sure that we get those put in. The last section, student is age 5 or under as of September 1st. Special education setting on line of enrollment is not appropriate for student age 5 or under. There are two sets of environment codes. One is for ages 5 and under, and one is for ages 6 and up. Make sure that the student is coded with the correct code based on their age as of September 1st. From year to year, there are a number of students that need to have that environment updated. Another important report to verify is the Special Education Event Verification Report. This report was developed primarily for the Student Record Report to verify event dates. However, we also ask that you look at it for FTE because it does help identify early issues, and there are some elements on this report that are related to FTE Count 1 and Count 3 reporting. The first thing to pay attention to is how the report is organized. It is organized by case manager. The very top section will include students that do not have a case manager. There could be several reasons for this. It may be that a student has withdrawn. In this case, you will see an enrollment end date and you can disregard those. Or it may be that the student has actually exited from special education but has not been properly exited in Infinite Campus. So they will still show a current IEP of yes and a blank special ed exit date. If this is the case, those students need to be updated accordingly. Also, there could be students who are just missing a case manager. So if you find any students in this section that are currently active special education students, then the case manager just needs to be entered in the Team Members tab. On the rest of the report, you will see that it is grouped by case manager. So as you are verifying your students, you want to make sure not only that you are verifying the information on the students that are there, but also that you verify that all of your students are listed, that there are none missing. Every year we miss out on some funding because for a couple of students that we failed to report as special education students in FTE. So make sure that all of your students are there, none are missing, and that the ones listed are accurate. The things you want to take a look at here first is the current IEP flag. Typically it should be yes. If it says no, just make sure that the student is one that was exited from special ed in the current school year. If a student shows up that was exited in the previous school year, the primary area should be blank. Also, make sure that you are verifying the primary area. If you are a teacher of younger students who now have a specific area of disability other than SDD, just make sure you attend to that and let the data clerk know what changes need to be made. Also, update the GAA flag for those students participating in the GAA assessment, and go ahead and take a look at alternate math sequence for high school students and extended year and update the flags as needed. The special education exit date is very important as well for those students exited in the current year or over the summer where they would have been reported last year as active in special education. Finally, there are several dates that have to be hand entered by the data clerks. They don't pull directly from the IEP. Those dates that if the parent revoked consent, student not eligible for initial placement, and parent refused placement. If you have any student that this applies to, they may not be showing up on this report, but please let the data clerk know so that she can hand enter those dates. The most important report for you to verify during the FTE process is the IEP file holder verification. This is a one-page per student report that details all FTE data elements that are reported in Count 1 and Count 3. The very first thing you want to do when you are handed these reports by your data clerk is to make sure that you have a form for every student that you serve. If you do not, let the data clerk know immediately so she can correct any coding that needs to be corrected and print you a new report for your verification. On the next several slides, we will look at this report section by section and go through what you need to look for as you verify your information.
We will start at the top, and one of the first elements you will see is the service time per week. Above the line, it shows the hours and minutes per week, and under the line, we show the total minutes per week. This is reported to the state as minutes. We just show the hours and minutes to make it easier for you to verify. The service minutes per week are pulled directly from the IEP. All service minutes are included except for transportation. The only time transportation minutes will be pulled is if there is a one-to-one bus aide or paraprofessional assigned specifically for that student. Also, I want to point out that because this does pull from the IEP, if you see an error, then it will need to be updated in the IEP. Another thing to note is that this is pulling the most recently locked IEP that includes the current service date. Right now, you probably have a lot of students with unlocked IEPs. If this is the case, this will be reported as blank or 0 until those IEPs are locked. You will be receiving deadlines for when these IEPs need to be locked so that this data does pull correctly. Next, you have the primary area of disability. Remember, TBI, autism, or SDD are valid primary areas, just not valid funding codes. So if a student is TBI, autistic, or SDD, list that as a primary area, but be sure to put an area served in Infinite Campus. One error or alert that you may see that will let you know if you don't have an area served is if you see blank segments in the charts that follow this section, or you see some odd things. For example, you may see some move on when ready segments for special education students that do not participate in a high school dual college credit course. This will look odd, so it is probably that you have coded it as a 6, which is a valid move on when ready segment code, because it is not seeing a valid area served to go along with that primary area. Finally, on the top of this page, you will see the special ed environment. It's very important to think about the place that services are delivered and whether or not the student is being included with their non-disabled peers, not looking at the special education services itself. For example, if you have a co-taught or collaborated classroom or a para or interpreter/supportive instruction situation, those services take place in a regular education classroom, so those should be considered as hours in general ed, not special ed.
Next, we will move to the actual FTE segments section of the report. This includes all of the data elements that are used to actually generate the funding for the students that you serve. FTE looks at 6 segments per day for each student. For students on a 6-period day, that is just the 6 periods of instruction that the student receives. For the schools on schedules with more than 6 periods, our high schools and elementary schools, those students receive funding for the 6 highest weighted segments. The other segments are dropped. Infinite Campus does use a combination of the course number and the inclusion codes to determine the funding category for each segment of the day. For example, for a student that has a 0 in the first place after the decimal, or a 3 or a 4, that is considered to be a regular education class and pull the regular education weight. But you will see in this example the Library Research Reading Skills class 35.0140070 pulls at the regular education weight. That is the least funded weight on the student schedule. Students with a .1 course number pull at the remedial or EIP weight, and you will see that for the Reading 07 connection class here. Those with a .2 will pull at the gifted funding weight. And students with a .8, which would be a resource or self-contained class, or a .9, which is a co-taught collab class, would pull at that student's area of disability. Now, those students that have a regular education or remedial or gifted course number but also have an inclusion code of 4 for para or 5 for interpreter, those students will earn at a level 5 funding weight, which is the inclusion weight. This is above regular ed funding but less than any of the specific funding categories for disability-specific weight. Now, you will see on this example, this is a middle school student with course numbers listed. For elementary, we have those blacked out because it's a little more confusing to see the course numbers there. Course numbers are not actually reported in FTE. They're just used in Infinite Campus to determine what those segment codes should be. And they're only a default, but they can be overwritten. As an example, let's say that this student had a 7-period day and a PE class is not showing up here. But for that PE class, a para goes with the student for supportive instruction. You could cross through that Library Research Skills class and just write in PE and then write an inclusion code of 4 for para, and your data clerk will understand what to do with that. Infinite Campus just pulled by default the Library Research course, but really it should have pulled the PE course. We just need to go and indicate that there's a para in that class so that it'll be pulled the right way. For elementary schools, you will not see those course numbers, but remember that we no longer award separate grades for reading. So to best approximate the amount of time that students spend on each subject at the elementary level, we elected to schedule language arts as a 3-period block, math as a 2-period block, and science and social studies together into 1 period. While this approximates the time that is spent in total in each one of those subject areas the closest, it can create some issues with what pulls by default in Infinite Campus for FTE segments for special education. For example, you may actually serve a student for just 1 segment per day as collab for language arts. It may pull because you're indicated as a collab inclusion code on that course that's scheduled for 3 periods. It may pull 3 non-inclusion codes. This would not be appropriate to claim if you were only in there for 45 minutes a day. So you would just mark through any of the excessive inclusion codes and the data clerk will go in and take those out. Another very important thing to look at here is how the inclusion codes align with the FTE segment types. You always have a special ed program specific segment type, that particular area of disability or the area they are most like or their secondary area of disability. That special ed FTE segment code either needs to stand alone or it needs to go with a 9 inclusion code for co-teaching or collaboration. It cannot be paired with a 4 para code. The opposite is true for your regular education segment codes, such as your regular grade level codes, EIP, remedial, and gifted. If you have students receiving services in one of those settings, then you would have a regular ed FTE segment type and the inclusion code could be either 4 for para or 5 for interpreter. This gets confusing because you cannot have a para or interpreter attached to a special ed segment type. These inclusion codes refer to supports for the student to be successful in the regular ed environment. You may very well have a hearing impaired interpreter with a student in a special education classroom, but you don't report it as inclusion because that support is not being given in order for the student to be successful in general ed. The next column you have is iterant teacher. If you are a teacher who travels for at least half of an FTE segment time during the school day, the FTE count day, and at least 90 minutes per week, now when we refer to travel, we mean traveling between school buildings, you would be eligible to code any students that you see on count day for iterant teacher funding. This gives us about 1/3 of a segment on top of what we already earn, and this helps offset some of the travel expenses for mileage when you're traveling between schools. Supplemental speech rarely applies. The definition of supplemental speech is students that receive speech services for less than the major portion of a segment and have 4 or more segments in a single area of disability. Most of our students, even when they are self-contained students, still receive speech for a full 30 minutes, so supplemental speech would not apply for that case. You would simply override one of the segment codes with a 3 for speech. Special ed transportation. This refers in this section to students being transferred from one functional setting to another during the school day. It does not refer to the bus ride to and from home in the school. This would be limited to situations such as students who are IEP'd to ride a specifically equipped bus from the home school to the career academy, or possibly those high school students who are transported to a work site, or maybe elementary students who are transferred from preschool intervention classroom they attend part of the day to a pre-K lottery classroom that they attend for part of the day. This is fairly rare, but we do have a few situations like this every year. As far as the funding that is concerned here in the middle, you will see that we attempt to show you what funding each student earns for each segment of the day. We do that to see and be aware of how much any mistakes made to data reporting might affect the actual operational dollars that you get at your school. This is just an approximation. There are some categories that if you report 4 or more segment codes for one student, the funding will actually decrease. This report doesn't go into that level of detailed approximation so that you can see what these students are earning for your school. The Invalid Inclusion Codes report will help you and the data clerk identify situations where the inclusion code that is aligned to the FTE segments is invalid.
On the previous slide, I mentioned that there are certain program codes for which, when you report students with 4 or more segment codes in that area of disability, funding actually decreases. While this can happen in many areas, primarily we see it occur in SLD and OHI reporting. This can occur because students are in a self-contained classroom or because they have enough co-teaching and co-lab sections combined with resource segments that they end up reporting 4 or more program codes in that particular area of disability. The funding difference can be quite extreme for that. For example, for an SLD student, if we only report 1 to 3 segments, we earn $1,677.53 per segment. However, if we report 4 to 6 segments, that falls to $1,118.29 per segment for a difference of $559.24 per segment. For OHI, the difference is even more extreme. For 1 to 3 segments, we earn $2,721.41 per segment, but if we go up to 4 to 6 segments, that amount falls to $1,677.53, resulting in a difference of $1,043.88 per segment. There is, in the FTE guidance, a statement that says if you are on a 7-period day, you can choose to drop the segment of choice in that calculation. Infinite Campus, however, looks at the segments individually and assumes that you want to report whatever is going to earn you the most money looking at that specific segment. But what we found is if there is a student and he's pulling exactly 4 segments in SLD or OHI, we are better off dropping one of those and picking up something else, even if it is just a regular ed segment. For example, if you had enough collab, co-teach, resource time to pull exactly 4 segments in OHI for an elementary student, chances are that Infinite Campus is trying to pull those 4 segments by default. But we would like to override one of those segments with, say, their PE class, just a regular ed segment code, because overall we end up earning more money for that student.
Your data clerk will run the special ed self-contained students in areas where funding levels decrease report. This will help you identify those situations discussed on the previous slide where a student may fall into a lower funding category because of the number of SLD or OHI segments that are being reported. These need to be reviewed, and hopefully you can override one of those codes with a regular ed code or another code other than the area of disability. There are resources located on the Georgia DOE website, as you can see here.
There are also several resources available to you on the Information Systems intranet site. If you log into the system website, go to Intranet Information Systems Full-Time Equivalent. The first thing you will find there is the FTE funding and class size chart. This lists both the class sizes that have been approved and the funding that applies to all education programs, both special ed and general ed. Also, you will find the FY20 FTE Earnings Estimate Worksheet. If you would like to look at different scheduling situations to see how they will impact an individual student's funding, you can select the segment codes and inclusion values here and see what happens to the child's overall funding. Unlike the individual student report that prints out of Infinite Campus, this spreadsheet will do the calculation to show the differences in students that have 4 or more segments in a single area of disability compared to those that have fewer than 4. This should give you an accurate estimation of the student's overall funding based on those program codes and the number of program codes reported. Finally, there is a special education services hours per week calculator. This will assist you if you have some IEPs that have a variety of frequencies indicated for services in the IEP. For example, you may have a particular service that is given daily for one subject, but 10 times a month for another subject because of A-B rotation. And then maybe there is also some consult time in there. That can get confusing with having to report as hours per week, so you can enter the data here as it appears in the IEP, and it will calculate for you the number of hours per week. Thank you for taking the time to review this presentation. Hopefully this will help you complete FTE accurately and maximize funding for your school. If you have any questions about specific students or IEPs, you may give me a call and I will be happy to assist you. Thank you.